Hello, good evening, and welcome to Face the Nation. In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man. Instead, bind him down from mischief with the chains of the Constitution. These were the sentiments expressed more than 200 years ago by one of the architects of another constitution, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. And in this time of conversation or discussion around constitutional reforms and governance in Sri Lanka, we thought it appropriate to discuss the intricacies of not only constitution making, but the purposes of a constitution, what really should be accomplished from it. Our topic of discussion today is the future of democratic governance in Sri Lanka, and we'll also be focusing specifically on the independence of the independent commissions. Let me quickly introduce our panelists to you this evening. From left to right, we have Dr. Mahim Mendis of the Open University of Sri Lanka. Dr. Mendis, thank you very much for joining us on the panel once again on Face the Nation. We are also joined by Professor Siri Hettige, Emeritus Professor of Sociology, Chair of the Sociology Department at the University of Colombo. Thank you very much, Professor Hettige, and also for however brief a period, a former chairman of the National Police Commission as well. We're also joined this evening by Dr. Rajiva Vijayasinghe, former State Minister of Higher Education, former leader of the Liberal Party, former Nationalist MP, and also a member of the Parliament that did introduce the 19th Amendment. Thank you very much, Professor Vijayasinghe, for joining us. And I'd actually like to start this evening's discussion with you. Being one of the lawmakers that was involved in the process of developing and passing the 19th Amendment, do you feel that it has accomplished what it was intended to, specifically in terms of the independent commissions?
No, not at all. You see, one of the principal points that we made, as you may know, I was one of the few people who, before the election, supported Maithripala Sirisena against Mahinda Rajapaksa from originally the government side. And I fully concurred with the idea that you needed to restrain the authoritarian power of the president. But what I did not want, and you will see that I proposed several amendments to the 19th Amendment. I knew they were useless. No one except Dinesh Gunawardene was interested. But I thought I had to make the point that this was a travesty of what we'd wanted. Because the way you control the executive is by strengthening the oversight functions of the non-executives. And this did not happen. What happened in the 19th Amendment, and you know, really all boils down to the horrible personality of Ranil Wickremesinghe. He wanted to get the executive power to his own hands. He was not prepared to pass on the control of the executive because A, he dreamed of usurping the president's power, and B, he was hoping to become president himself. So what you had is a so-called constitutional council which was not independent of the executive. The executive appointed it. And things were made worse because it is important to have oppositional representation in any oversight body. The last parliament cut out the opposition entirely and gave places to Mr. Sambandhan, who was one of Ranil Wickremesinghe's poodles, and another to the JVP, who was the poodles. So you had this extraordinary situation where the Constitutional Council consisted largely initially of members of the executive. The second one is a bit better structurally, but it's people appointed by the executive. So how was it set up? It was, you know, here is one for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. In fact, even if you look at the way it's appointed, people say that this was the Prime Minister's choice, this was the opposition leader's choice. Whereas in fact it says it should be by consensus. Now you take the Human Rights Commission. Look at the way it's been appointed. It was all imposed, partly because President Sirisena knew nothing of human rights. So he allowed the UNP to appoint it. And it was entirely what I might call a Radhika Kumaraswamy set of people.
Dr. Vijayasinghe, I think...
but let me just say, Radhika herself understands.
I just...
you want to say that I take responsibility for what I say. You know perfectly well I always do.
Yeah.
Take one of the people on it, Ambika Satkutanathan. She used to support the LTT. I remember when I was Secretary of the Peace Secretariat, I told Neil Kemp, head of the UNDP, why do you have
it's also
this
appropriate
person?
not to level allegations against persons who are not here to defend them.
No, everyone knows about it. She can always come back. I'm happy to talk to her. And Neil told me, no, she has changed. She's better now. But to put her, because she didn't get the position of chair of ICS, which Radhika wanted, to put on the Human Rights Council, it's a rubber stamp. You want a range. And what does Deepika Udugama do now? She ignores Sri Lankan suffering. I have written to her, other people have, about the poor man who was in jail for 14 years after Lakshman Kandaragam was killed. The man who cut a tree. A poor Tamil labourer. The person who ordered him to cut the tree was kept scot-free because he's a Colombo 7 person. Deepika ignores that and she jumps in to satisfy the Swiss embassy. Human rights is not about keeping the West happy. It is about keeping our people happy, and that is why you must have much stricter rules of procedure. In the constitution that I suggested we have instead, I have said put the Human Rights Commission into the constitution. It's not in the constitution now, going on the first thing you said, tie people down. And I have said make sure that they care for the vulnerable, the women, those taken into custody with no reason, the children who are not looked after when they are put into children's homes, the vulnerable, the young people remanded with no reason when they should not be sent to jail. That is what they should be doing.
We'll come back to you later. Professor Hettige, I'd like to move to you next. As I mentioned at the start, you were, for however brief a period, chairman of the National Police Commission. We've seen a spate of transfers that have happened within the police department in the recent weeks, as is generally tends to happen whenever administrations change. However, with these transfers are now, as is my understanding, have to be approved by the National Police Commission. And it just seems that there is no real vetting process when granting approvals for transfer requests that are submitted by the Inspector General of Police, or in this case, the acting IGP. Is this the case? Because there was talk, and if you go to the Commission's website, they say that they have a national transfer policy in place. But what exactly the transfer policy is remains a mystery.
I do not really want to comment on how things are happening right now, but I want to say that my approach has always been from one particular angle, and that is, the angle of professionalism. It's not just about law enforcement, it's also about so many other things that are happening in different sectors. For instance, we want to have a professional public service. There might be all kinds of legal connotations in, establishing various commissions and various institutions. But the fact of the matter is that we, certainly would want, high degree of professionalism in various sectors. I think, we don't have much of a problem in accepting this particular viewpoint when it comes to certain areas. Like, for instance, we would like to have, the electricity supply to be, very, very efficient. We don't want breakdowns in the electricity supply. Similarly, when it comes to water supply and so on and so forth. And that is because where we emphasize that things have to be done professionally, things have to be organized professionally and so on. I think when you...
Do you think that the independent commissions have been organized professionally? Do you think that they are truly independent and that
absolutely. Now, actually, when I joined the commission, I had only one interest in mind, and that is, like any other sector, we have to have people who would approach problems from a professional angle. Of course, if you ask, a person in the law enforcement sector, he or she would say what professionalism in that sector is all about. Same, with, any other area. So I think the problem is that when you have, a situation where certain institutions, tend to deal with matters that are, let's say, contentious, controversial, and so on and so forth, naturally you come across this kind of situations. So what we observe actually in let's say in the law enforcement sector is very much due to that. Yeah, but I feel is that that maybe we are somehow naive to assume that you can apply this idea of professionalism across the board, in any sector. But, coming from a sociological background, coming from a comparative, sociology background, I basically look at society, as one where, there is division of labor, and that there is division of labor based on expertise, because we are living in a very complex world today. Take for instance, in the case of Sri Lanka, it's a very complex, environment. For instance, whether it is the economy, whether it is the social, security systems, whether it is, providing various services to people like education, health, and so on. So I basically assume that you can have a better society, you can have an efficient, let's say, governance arrangement in the country if you, apply the principle of professionalism. But maybe that I am naive, and that is probably the reason why we assume that, this whole idea of professionalism applicable across the board, but apparently it is not so.
Thank you, Professor Hettige. Dr. Mendis, moving to you. Professor Hettige was, in a nutshell, indicating that, it should be the duty of government, the primary duty of any government or the state is to serve the public, to ensure that public services are delivered efficiently. But when you have the kind of system that we are mired in at the moment, where the driving force on any kind of reform is always to do with power politics, can you really have that sort of motivation for efficient public services? And can these really be resolved through constitution making? For example, we saw recently where, if you take the recent statement that was made by the new Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, on issues pertaining to the 19th Amendment, which he had hinted at, let's say, in his statement. Do you feel that moves to remove checks and balances on executive power will result in a more professional and efficient public service?
What I see is that we are burdened by a society with people, especially when it comes to professionals, lacking in principles, a normless society. We are basically dealing with people who are not able to speak out what is right, even when they know what is right. When it comes to the independent commissions, we saw that, as Professor Hettige rightly said, there were many flaws, deficiencies, but at the end of the day, they were prepared to tolerate these deficiencies and move ahead, not really achieving anything substantial, knowing very well that there are deficiencies. It's like that they were more concerned about holding into these positions. Well, I'm not trying to condemn my good colleague, Professor Hettige. Of course, he resigned from the police commission. But we need to accept that when we assume office in these commissions, well, if the checks and balances, if the provisions that are available are not to our satisfaction, we should not be holding positions at all. Well, we have been extremely indifferent and apathetic as a society, especially at a time that many people say that the professionals need to take over, and more professionals should be in government and in decision-making bodies. All what I can say is that professionals also have proved that they can make things a mockery.
They have been aiding and abetting a process of degrading democracy, undermining democracy. People who have gone into parliament, even from the universities, have been excelling in making black white and white black. Opportunism had been the order of things. So all what I can say is that all this has created a situation for politicians who have been crooked for quite a long period of time. Whether the people who have come to power now or then, well, have been crooked. They have been opportunists. They have been extremely driven by self-interest. And now they say, look at this 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It's a mockery and we need to do away with that.
Dr. Mendis, the problem of crooked politicians or self-serving politicians is not one that is unique to Sri Lanka. I mean, you see this all over the world. I'm sure in every country in the world you encounter the problem to varying extents along the spectrum of crookedness, but there are always going to be crooked and self-serving politicians. But in spite of that, in many countries, it doesn't have as damaging an effect on the delivery of public services that Professor Hettige was talking about. Why is it in Sri Lanka that we have the crooked and self-serving politicians, but we are unable to get any kind of efficiency in delivering public services?
Yeah, I need to repeat again. You see, when you say crooked, whether it be those in Parliament, the people who have been engaged in constitutional amendments, well, it's very clear that what has come out by way of constitutional amendments, at the end of the day, are coming out of people who are unprincipled. They knew very well that they were playing with a process. They were playing with the mandate of the people. The 2015, the mandate for a Yahapalana, good governance regime, was made a mockery. They willfully did things to undermine, let's say, in the very first week after the general election, getting people who were rejected by the people through the back door into parliament, and even making them ministers. These are extremely disgraceful things that would not easily happen in other countries, even in the South Asian region, anywhere else. Willfully standing for what is wrong, without any shame, disgracing themselves and disgracing the nation at large. This has been the problem for many, many years.
Thank you very much,
leading to a failed state.
Mahim Mendis. Let me quickly introduce our panel of journalists this evening. To my immediate left is Deshan Gonawala, and on my far left, John Fernando. Let's start this evening with John.
Yes, thank you, Nadeem. Well, my first question goes to Dr. Mendis, you and Dr. Vijay Singh and Professor Siri Hettige. Please feel free to jump in with your opinion, which we highly encourage. Well, this question relies on something like this. Now, the general public tend to point the finger at a regime that has been appointed, saying that they tend to cover up the mistakes of the previous regime. What should actually happen is, once a government is appointed, if there was fraud and corruption which was carried out by the previous regime, a proper legal method should be followed and the individuals who are responsible should be brought to justice. Now, when this regime was appointed as well, we saw some critical positions in the state service was transferred. Even before we saw critical positions once again in the state service, they were sent overseas or they went overseas. Some claim death threats were made. So this allegation that the general public point out towards a regime, saying that once a regime is appointed, they tend to cover up the mistakes of the previous regime. How would you respond to that?
So once again, what we see is that there is normlessness, there is no proper standard, there is no benchmark, whether it be the previous regime that covered most of the charges leveled against. You see the previous regime you see it acting with impunity in places like Velikada and Ratupaswala, in Halawata, in Katunayaka, all those things. The people were asking, I think Mr. Wickramasinghe says that, you see, all what happened, you see, in the south was the Sinhala Buddhist vote base was not there for the UNP. I think that is absolutely a chronic explanation. You see, the people were asking one clear question as to what the Wickramasinghe regime was doing with the very charges that were brought against the Rajapaksa regime in 2015 in order to get a mandate. We were talking about good governance in a context where impunity, willful undermining of the rule of law happened to be the status quo. So all what I want to tell you is that whether it be the previous regime, the so-called Yahapalana regime, or the current regime that has come in order to make things better, they need to understand one thing. The Rajapaksas need to understand, and Mr. Wickramasinghe and the UNP should understand very clearly that there are issues that have not been adequately explained. The people may have changed the regime, but the people are disgruntled. I don't think the people have forgiven those who used their power, whatever executive power, to order the army or the police to enter the Velikada prison and so on and open fire at people.
Exactly.
Well, Mr. Rajapaksa should tell very clearly to the people as to what happened in those situations. Whether the government had any hand in that, well, who is responsible? You cannot. Just like the Wickramasinghe regime, this government cannot escape rational, logical, reasonable explanation to these matters. And also I'm asking this government, or whatever government, not to allow the international community to be raising difficult questions from the Republic of Sri Lanka because of the manner in which they try to cover up issues deliberately and against their very conscience.
Yes, Professor Wijesinghe, I want to bring this question to you, particularly since you had some experience as part of the Rajapaksa regime and also the Yahapalana regime. So, you know, adding on to what Dr. Mendis mentioned, you saw over the course of the last few years, in particular, you had a number of allegations raised, be it the bond scam, be it the issues that went on at the Ministry of Housing. You know, you had a number of issues also where police officers had supposedly carried out activities that were not within their mandate. You had a number of issues like this. What this suggests to me, and I'm sure to a large amount of the general public as well, is that this is a continuing trend. Is it that our institutions aren't able to tackle these issues? Because we have an anti-corruption body, we have now a police commission as well, we have laws in place to some degree at least to look at this, or are they just looking away?
I think you need to look at this in terms of exactly what the motivations are of those in charge. And the real tragedy of 2015, and I think I was the only idiot who suffered because I started idealistic and I stood by my ideals. No one else, as Mahim said, bothered to say a word about what happened right through those 5 years. And you know, I'm sorry for Sajid Premadasa because the poor man had to run in an election with this albatross round his neck. But he had done nothing about the albatross for 5 years. So, you know, I mean, he was the only person in the UNP who called me when I resigned and said, please don't go. And I was touched by that. But did any of them bother to tell Ranil where to get off? Only Vasantha Sennayak and Harsha De Silva after 2018. And Harsha promptly backtracked when the Americans scolded him. But, Deshan, the point that you have to remember is that some of us thought we wanted a change. But from the beginning I said, please do not engage in retribution. Because no one wants retribution. Especially in a context in which Mahinda Rajapaksa was very respected for what he'd done for the country. But the people said, no, we are now tired of your government. But to try to punish him was vindictive. I tried to tell Karuja Asure, claimed to be Minister of Democratic Governance, stop this rubbish. And Karu said, you know, I can't do anything, my hands are tied, he doesn't trust me. So Karu spent the next 5 years running behind Ranil, trying to get himself trusted. I mean, disgraceful. But What should have happened was transparency. If there's anything for which President Sirisena needs to be thanked, it is that President Sirisena actually had commissions of inquiry which brought out certain issues, and no one can now deny the facts that are there. The only problem was when that idiot who is now our Chief Justice was given the right to prosecute.
Again, Dr. Vijay Singh, I'd like you to refrain from using derogatory language to describe.
Why, if people behave badly? You know, one thing that stunned me about Mahim, who made some very good points. He's so mealy-mouthed, he won't say who did what. There was a slight reference to President Sirisena who put in defeated candidates.
I'll have to ask you to withdraw the I word that you used.
No, I don't withdraw. You can refrain from inviting me to your programs again.
I'm not
but you have made your point that MTV doesn't think the Chief Justice is an idiot. That's very kind of you. But you remember the way he questioned Ranil Wickremesinghe over the bond scam. After the brilliant performance of the AG's department, which got so many facts out, that questioning when he sent him notes in advance, you probably read the way I analyzed Ranil's responses. That was unforgivable. And what was his reward? You become Chief Justice. So I'm sorry, that sort of behavior will not do. But Sirisena did appoint commissions. Certain things came out. But there wasn't fact-finding. There was hole and corner fact-finding, allowing all these allegations that the police made things up. And why was this happening? Because that very government was engaged in much bigger corruption than anything that had happened previously, the bond scam. So I think, Deshal, the point that you have to remember is that you need leadership. And the Rajapaksa government provided leadership. There were certain things that were wrong, but it led the country. Between Sirisena and Wickremesinghe, they led the country backwards for 5 years. How could they do that? And why did nobody in that party protest? That is what I find shocking.
Professor Hettige, you've had the speakers on either side of you express their views, and a lot of it is politics, politics, politics. Is it politics? If it is politics, which I'm not denying it is, what's our way out? How do we ensure that people start doing the right thing?
I think our problem is that we basically get trapped in this very insular discussion about our situation in this country. You know, Sri Lanka is just one among so many countries in the world. You know, and there are different political systems, there are different economies, you know, there are different cultures and so on and so forth. And I think we have to really, you know, locate Sri Lanka in that larger context, because we are living in an integrated world today. We are living in a globalized world today. We are living in a world where we interact with the rest of the world on a day-to-day basis. You know, we have 1.6 million people from Sri Lanka not living here but working in different parts of, you know, Middle East and so on and so forth. And how many lakhs of Sri Lankans are, in fact, you know, living in other countries, you know, having some of the family members here left behind. And then, you know, look at our economy, you know, I mean, and so on and so forth. And, you know, look at, everything that, that we are talking about. Let's say, for instance, the media itself. So the point is that we are trying to, you know, explain everything, that happens here in terms of, matters that are really around us. No, I think we have to locate ourselves in that larger context. Actually, if you really look at, nothing can be discussed in isolation. You know, there's a history, there's a chronology, and there's nothing, that is absolute in that sense. You have to locate it to the past and the present and the future. You have to, and then also we have to take the whole, space factor into consideration. I mean, we are in this region, for instance, in the Asian region. And then we are also connected to that. So the point is that we'll have to really locate, whatever we discuss in that larger context, that deals with, history on the one hand and so on. I'll just give an example. Now we are talking about politics and law. But, societies are not revolving around law and politics. Where is morality? For instance, You know, it was over 100 years ago that, let's say a very well-known, French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, he wrote this very important book, over 100 years ago about professional ethics and civic morals. You see, so if everything can be reduced to this, thing called, rule of law, there was no reason for people to write about, professional ethics and civic morals. You can't deal with all these issues that we are confronted with in a court of law, because so many issues have to be sorted out among people. And within institutions and so on.
Now, Dr. Mendis, we are here talking about commissions and the role they can play in advancing governance. Just before John asks his question, I'm sure he can add to this. Professor Hettigai is speaking about how morality plays a part as well. And we are talking about how potentially commissions, if strengthened, can contribute to your national development. Are we looking in the wrong places? Are we, I'm sure Professor Vijay Singh can add some things. Are we not looking at education enough and a more wholesome education as opposed to just trying to strengthen the legal systems that suss out powers?
To add to that question, Deshan, now you spoke about commissions. We see a fact that, or an idea that we all accept is a country, yes, should be ruled by politicians or should be governed by politicians, but things like the economy, things like the education, key sectors that rule the country should be guided by professionals. But it seems like these commissions, which are, where professionals are appointed, still politicians have a huge impact on these commissions.
Now, on that, I would like to add something. In the original list of commissions, there were two very important commissions, and they were dropped. And I felt at that time that these were the two most important commissions for Sri Lanka. What are the two commissions? One was the National Planning Commission, and the other was the National Education Commission. Of course, we have one which is not an independent commission. You see, the point is that education, as you rightly mentioned, is very critical.
Definitely.
Because, we are talking about citizens in a modern state. Now, have we been able to really produce a population in this country who would fit into a modern democratic state? Have we done that? And what is the role of education in that?
Professor Hettigai, on that note, I just want to give Dr. Mendis the opportunity. Are we looking in the right places? And Professor Vijay Singh, feel free to interject. Are we not giving enough attention to education? Dr. Mendis.
Well, at the end of the day, from where is this really coming? We are talking about a breakdown, collapse of social institutions. Of these social institutions within the state, Rajya, well, we see that the government is the most formidable of all social institutions. And there is a crisis. There's a crisis in education, there's a crisis in values, in religion as a social institution, right? And we see that inability to instill in people certain values, certain norms, attitudes, you see, led to an enormous crisis. Of course, one of the presidential candidates, Mr. Premadasa, was trying to tell the people that early childhood education is so chaotic in this country. The first 5 years of a person's, development of the brain, is all messed up in this country because...
And on that note, I think Professor Vijay Singh can add something with regard to that as... Yes, of course.
Yes,
well, he was interested, not because Mr. Premadasa made it, that I'm telling you.
Yeah.
He made a valid point that this education system, is in crisis from the time a person is born into the first 6 years. Before a person goes into the first grade, well, there is no proper planned curriculum to inculcate values in this country. The people are molded by a system which is no system at all.
Absolutely. Professor Vijay Singh, we had this government in place for 5 years. It's very nice putting it on a manifesto at an election and saying we've not had it. But if you have government for 5 years, you have 5 different budgets that are presented to potentially actually look at funding, let's say, early childhood education. Do you think that education is the key issue that is affecting the success of our commissions and institutions?
Let me put it this way. I think you were very gently reprimanding Professor Mendis, my former student, one of the brightest, I should add, because the simple point is how nice of Sajid to remember early childhood in 2019. He was in the cabinet for 5 years. The issue was never raised. I think that was the point you were trying to make. But the real problem is we don't have a cabinet. One of the reasons is we have a massive cabinet. You can't have the in-house discussions that a good cabinet should have. I think the present president has taken a step in the right direction with a very small cabinet. And although I regret him having the maximum number practically of state ministers, at least they are not the cabinet. It is cabinet responsibility. Government is by the cabinet. That is the executive, not the president, not the prime minister. But having said that, to me the point about professionalism you made, Professor Hettige made, it's so simple, and I really cannot understand why none of my colleagues who are intellectuals are not insisting on this point. Any appointment made must be explained to the people. I tried to put this in my idea for the commissions. I've tried to say this in Parliament. If you are appointing someone to anything, you must give a reason for it. Again, the present president has taken a step in the right direction by asking for nominations and a committee of experts. But he will only take that to the right degree if when A or B, C is appointed chairman of the National Education Commission or chairman of the Police Commission or chairman of the Human Rights Commission, there is a paragraph available to the public saying these are the reasons X has been appointed. That is something all of you should insist on. That is transparency. At the moment, arbitrary appointments used to be made by the president. So anyone goes up to the president and says, I say my uncle has nothing to do, can you give him a job? Now what happens is they go to the commission and say, my uncle has nothing to do, give them a job. Now, take education. I say this absolutely confidently. I know more about education than anyone in this country because I have worked at every level. I have innovated more than everybody. And talking about early childhood, I was doing a curriculum for training of people for early childhood to involve them in activity-based learning, not what happens now. Then I got sacked. That was another question by President Sirisena. But having said that, why are we not working professionally towards these areas? Why are we not insisting that anyone who's appointed, you must explain to the people why? The people must be able to challenge it. 2 simple facts that I argued in 2015. One was that. The second was assets declarations. Why the hell should people have to go and ask for assets declarations of people in public life? They should be on websites. Why are you all not asking for that? Why didn't Sajid say that? For instance, why are we hiding our assets declarations? When I was the presidential candidate, I gave mine in, and the Elections Commission, yes, we put it in an envelope. I said, look, put it on a website, but make sure other people put theirs on a website, because the public ultimately are the best agents of oversight. They must have the right to see all these things. And why not? If you go into public life, you must be prepared to have your assets in the eye of the public. Now, with regard to education, one of the biggest problems we have is a complete lack of continuity. When Professor Hettige mentioned the NPC and the NEC, he was perfectly right. Those are really very, very important. But what happens? People get sacked. The reason I resigned from my post of state minister was because Kabir Hashim, who had assured me he wouldn't interfere, started interfering and sacked the UGC. And when I protested, they said, no, you can appoint anyone you like, but the appointments must come from you, not Mahinda Rajapaksa's. Ridiculous. If Mahinda Rajapaksa appointed someone, I continue to believe that Chanaki Mburagam was a very good UGC chairman. There are political pressures on her, but she generally did an excellent job. Why should she be sacked just because there's a new minister? She actually came to me and said, should I resign? I said, no, because I want to work. You know what's going on. And nobody stood up for her after that. And what did the UNP do? They appointed 7 people from Colombo with no idea of what was in the country. None of you all protested. Fortunately, the president put Mohan de Silva instead, also from Colombo, but at least he wasn't part of the elite. But nobody has a system. When people are appointed to the UGC, you must be able to say, for this reason we are appointing them. The National Education Commission should be the same. When I was head of the TVC, I introduced a lot of ideas into the NEC. When I got sacked, I just rang up and said, what's happening? They said, no, we have more important things to do. I was talking about counseling, I was talking about training, I was talking about standards so that everyone knows what an O-level means, you know, what they call the qualifications framework. And you know what the vice chairman told me? No, we have more important things to think of. So I said, what? We have to work out the criteria for our staff. So you set up a body, and then they spend all their time looking at whom they hire. So there's no continuity in educational policy. There's no continuity in higher educational policy. So how can we succeed?
Thank you, Professor Vijay Singh. On that note, we'll go in for a short commercial break. I'd like to leave you with a thought on education, though. Aristotle says that the legislator should direct his attention above all to the education of youth. The character of democracy creates democracy, and the character of oligarchy creates oligarchy. We'll see you right after this break. Welcome back to the program. We're talking about democratic governance in Sri Lanka, and a key theme that we were really talking about towards the end of the previous session was the importance of education in ensuring the character of our country, in identifying those values that are necessary to ensure that there is efficiency and professionalism in the upper stages of when you get to a government. We left with a quote where we said, the character of democracy creates democracy. Professor Hettige, you mentioned something very important in your thoughts earlier, where you said that from amongst the independent commissions, there were 2 very important commissions that were omitted from the final list. These were the National Planning Commission and the National Education Commission. One would think that, especially with education, that you'd want to safeguard that from political interference.
Actually, you know, the present crisis that we are talking about in the country, I mean, we have been talking about a crisis for a long time, but you know, this particular crisis actually is very much rooted in one very important issue, and that is the nexus between education and a functioning democracy. You know, it was over 100 years ago, John Dewey, he was an educational philosopher. In 1915, he published this, you know, treatise, Education and Democracy. Basically, the idea was that you cannot have a functioning modern democracy unless you prepare the people to fit into that kind of a modern functioning democracy. You know, so therefore, you have to start with education. And that is possible because in Sri Lanka, we had, you know, the education bill that established free education in 1939. And, you know, education, you know, became the most desired goal of any parent in this country ever since. And we have a situation where we have a school in every village and more than one school in some villages and so on and so on. So the point is we laid the foundation even before independence. Even before independence. Now we would have basically used that infrastructure and we would have used the large teacher population in this country. Now it is about 250,000 or more. So the point is we never bothered to use the most important, you know, institution, that is education, to prepare our people to fit into a modern functioning democracy. Now that is really why this Independent National Education Commission was so important. And I could not believe that it was dropped. But, you know, in fact, it was dropped. And the other thing is, of course, the National Planning Commission. You know, we know that this economy has been in disarray for a long time. And, you know, this is one of the most distorted economies in the region. Now, therefore, it would have been common sense for decision makers to basically establish that professionally oriented planning commission in this country. Now, we would have with these 2 institutions, you know, National Planning Commission, independent, managed by professionals coming from a whole range of disciplines, as you have in the case of India, and an independent education commission that has the capacity and the authority to manage the sector in a way that would help the country to achieve national goals. And we have a whole range of national goals. Today, we are not talking about literacy, in the conventional sense, no. We are not talking about reading and writing skills anymore. There are 3 or 4 literacies that we are talking about these days. We are talking about digital literacy. How can you function today without digital literacy? Because all these gadgets that we are using is based on digital literacy, number one. Number two, how can you be functioning in the modern world unless you have environmental literacy? Because we have this massive crisis created by climate change. And therefore, we should be aware of the situation that we are confronted with. And then finally, scientific literacy. We need a population that is capable of understanding the world in terms of modern ideas and modern concepts.
Thank you,
but
Professor.
The point, I think so that is why I'm saying that we are looking at the wrong thing. We are trying to find fault with certain institutions and so on and so forth, whereas we have not done our homework. We have not created the conditions that are absolutely necessary to create a functioning democracy in this country.
Thank you very much, Professor Hettige. John and Deshan, please feel free to chip in with your questions as well. Dr. Mendis, I'd like to ask you, judging by what Professor Hettige says, if you're going for reform through education, then it's unlikely that you'll see change in the present, or at least that in our lifetime, because it will be for the next generation to then implement or bring about that change. You reform the education system. But a lot of people want to see change right now in how the country is run and how services are delivered. Education will bring in, or reforming education will bring in that change at some point in the future. But for the people who are living now, it would mean having to suffer through the current system. Is there no means by which we can have both happening in tandem?
See, some fundamental issues need to be addressed. In post-independent Sri Lanka, we see that very clearly that we have not respected. We're talking about education. We have not respected fundamental principles of equality, equity, equal distribution of resources, equality in educational standards in 9 provinces in 25 districts. We are talking about basic primary literacy, which is, even by the time when we were born, many years ago, well, we were talking about 99% primary literacy, which is nursery to grade 5. But what is the real situation? What is the real status? What is the level of secondary literacy in this country? Is less than 50%. Tertiary literacy, university education and above, people who have completed a university degree or an equivalent professional qualification, is approximately maybe 8 to 9%. So 91% tertiary illiterate people. Now, Professor Hettige was talking about various other forms of literacy. But we need very clearly a visionary leader for this country, and we were having 2 options at the last elections. People have opted for one. And a visionary leader who will be able to think about what has not been addressed in post-independent Sri Lanka.
Dr. Mendis.
We need a decent education system for the ordinary people.
Can I just suggest one of the ways to move forward, not that it will ever happen, is that hoping that Sajith Premadasa becomes leader of the opposition, you should immediately ask to see the president and said, look, can we reach consensus on 5 or 6 issues of reform and make the necessary changes in the Constitution, getting rid of the worst features of the 19th Amendment but keeping the good ones. That requires a visionary opposition leader. Now, if this boy has the courage to do that and the capacity, I think you can have a consensus within 2 months. You can have consensus on education, You can have consensus on certainly economic policy. Both, I think, are very keen on both maintaining sovereignty but restoring confidence. In order to have confidence, which investors want, a certain, cross-party consensus on basic issues is necessary, and the opening has to come from the opposition. But you see, Ranil Wickremesinghe was incapable of this because he wanted to continue leader of the opposition so that he can enjoy the perks if he couldn't be president. We know that. But Sajid, who I hope thinks that the country needs a future, that it won't die with him as Ranil thought it would with him, I hope that Sajid will have the courage to go to the president and say, look, why don't we agree on 10 things and do the reforms immediately? Some constitutional changes. And he should be visionary and make it clear that he's prepared to cooperate. That is what should happen. That's the only way forward, to get some sort of rational consensus to move.
Professor Hettiger, do you think that we can build that kind of rational consensus given the very heavily polarized political climate that we're in?
But the point is that the challenges that we are facing are so enormous that we have to find common ground, across the board. I mean, the point is that we can't be focused entirely on, the political process, continuous elections. And, we have had elections, from the time of independence, regularly, very peaceful and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that we have not been able to really address fundamental issues in our society. I mean, the point is that unless you address fundamental issues in society, and that society is bound to go into crisis. And that is exactly what has happened here. As I already mentioned, rule of law is important. There's no question about it. And parliamentary democracy is important, no question about it. And then, of course, it is important to have the institutions, because modern institutions are so important. But the fact of the matter is that there has to be consensus built on, ethics and morality. The point is, at the end of the day, the values that, he just mentioned, equality of opportunity. When you deny equality of opportunity, it leads to conflict. That is obvious. And similarly, equality of opportunity is also, really productive, because it really, help us to mobilize, the talent, in the country. Because we know that,
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah,
Dr. Vijay on this issue of building consensus, even on issues in the past where there has been, or at least on paper, a stated commitment to even reforms that you have argued for in the past, like amending the standing orders of Parliament to ensure that there is a better system of accountability within the Parliament and without introducing the code of conduct for MPs, then what you were mentioning earlier about asset declarations, digitizing asset declarations. These are all commitments that are already there on paper, that there is, at least for appearances' sake, bipartisan or multi-partisan consensus, but there is no implementation.
The point, Nadeem, you have to remember is there was no consensus because Ranil Wickremesinghe is a liar. The standing orders, take the standing orders. We had them almost redone in 2015. Then Chamal Rajapaksa, who was a good speaker, he said, well, we can't do the committees because Ranil says wait until his paper comes through on what he called oversight committees. But we got consensus in the standing order committee. Chamal was there, Nimal Siripala was there. We got consensus on giving teeth to the oversight committees, COPA and COPA. We agreed that their reports must be actioned by the ministers, or the ministers must explain in writing why not. The Secretary General of Parliament pointed out rightly that the legislature cannot tell the executive what to do, but it can hold it accountable. And the executive must say, okay, we will follow your recommendations, or we will explain why we can't do it. We got consensus on the consultative committees, because at the moment the consultative committees are a joke. If you've been there, they're all parochial issues. We got a situation where there are policy-making legislative committees, that is a function of committees in every other parliament in the world. But in Sri Lanka, they look at issues. We said, no, let the minister have a meeting once a month in his ministry so that people can say, I don't have a bridge, or I don't have a school, I don't have a teacher, and the officials don't have to come to Parliament, otherwise they all wasted their time. All that was done, but Ranil delayed it. Then I asked Priyani Wijayasekara, you know, another idiot whom he had made ambassador to Austria, who had to be sacked. And I said, why aren't you giving the report? He said, I got it ready, but Ranil told me not to present it. He wanted to delay because he was pushing Sirisena to dissolve Parliament. Electoral reform, the second great pillar of the 2015 reform program. Ranil killed it. Mahinda Deshapriya told me, make a lacing karanna pulang, agamati meka karanna dende naane. He kept bringing objections, we need consensus. The president promised Nimal Siripala he wouldn't dissolve. That's how he got our support until the 20th Amendment came through, and then Sirisena broke his promise as usual. So the consensus died because it was Ranil, and that is why I'm asking you, as an advisor of Sajid, to get Sajid to move towards consensus, not on everything, but on 5 issues of national importance. If he has the courage to do that, we can move forward.
Dr. Mendes, on some of these issues at least, let's say on asset declarations, for example, in his manifesto as a presidential candidate, then Minister Sajid Premadasa had pledged that if he is elected, that the asset declarations of his cabinet ministers would be published annually. On that kind of issue, do you think that we can see a push forward, that there will be, because as it was said earlier in the show as well, I think that one of the best forms of accountability is public oversight. And if that information is available to the public, you would be giving the public power over the people that they are electing into office. And that might be a way to start fixing the system. Do you think that this is a realistic expectation that we can have from the members of Parliament who are there currently, and who, a lot of whom will most probably return to Parliament at the next election?
This way or that way, very clearly the people have made a choice. And we see in the defeated candidate, Sajid Premadasa, obviously a principled, visionary leader in my estimation, who was extremely committed to do a job of work with much, you see, sincerity. And as Professor Rajiva very clearly stated, we need a visionary leader in the government. We also need a visionary opposition leader. And we need to have a new, refined political culture, progressive political culture, not the type of reactionary political culture that we had all these years, which creates enormous burdens for the people. Now, obviously, if there is, I hope and pray that there will be very clearly a leadership change in the United National Party and in the opposition leader position, which will enable what we did not have all these years, to make it a reality. Well, of course, the two leaders as it is, well, we expect Mr. Rajapaksa to be a reasonable, insightful leader, and then a visionary. If we have a visionary opposition leader, equally committed, well, we see that most likely in Mr. Premadasa, they will be able to reach consensus on fundamental issues like in education, health, various other sectors that really have been a clear burden to the people. Well, of course, they have to go back to elections, fight for better policies, let the people decide on who is better. But we need a visionary leadership in both frontiers, opposition and the government, consensual politics, where they will be able to reach consensus, even for the next few years, as to where the education system should be heading towards. The plight of the women, the plight of youth, the plight of children. Well, obviously, Mr. Premadasa had a number of charters signed. He was extremely committed to make it the law of the land.
With Dr. Mendes, as much as we need visionary leaders, because Sri Lanka is a democracy, we also need to be able to hold those visionary leaders accountable. So on these issues of accountability of the elected representatives, of disclosing their campaign funding sources, of making their asset declarations public, letting the people know that they are, there to serve them and not there to serve their own interests. Do you feel that that kind of movement can be realistically expected in the current political climate?
Well, the people expect that. The people who expected change from Mr. Rajapaksa and Mr. Premadasa, massive, you see the voter base that they enjoy between them. Well, the people expect certain things to happen, not tomorrow, today itself, very urgently. And I believe, of course, now Mr. Premadasa is not the president, Mr. Rajapaksa should very seriously commit himself to the first steps that need to be taken with regard to transparency, with regard to electoral funds and so on, election funds, campaign funds and all that. The burden falls on the Rajapaksa regime now to make it a reality. Of course, the people expect that, whoever they voted for, the people expect honest, sincere, committed, passionate, insightful leadership in this country that will certainly make a difference for the future.
Dr. Mendes, I'm not very optimistic in your faith in the people in general, but John, go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Mendes, I would like to divert our attention to a different perspective when we take a look at this whole issue. Now, we witnessed during the presidential election when campaigning was happening, we saw a strong alternative in action as well. The same people who requested change, same people who requested something different or something new from the traditional politics that we experienced so far in this country, the same people who said that voted for another major political faction, and then we have the throne rests once again in the hands of the traditional political faction that we experienced so far. Dr. Rajiv Vijayasinghe, you were a presidential candidate. I believe you represented part of the alternative as well. So right now, where does the alternative rest? What's the role of the alternative while two major political factions are in action of governing the country?
You see, one of the things I was trying to do, when you talk of the alternative, I think there were about 6 serious candidates. And I was trying to get them to appear together to ask people to vote for an alternative. Unfortunately, most of them wanted to say, no, why don't we all back one person? And I said, we can't do that. We promised not to. But let's say we want to present a consensus, the same thing I'm saying now. Can we take 5 points on which we are agreed? For instance, yes, the so-called independent commissions must remain independent, but not at the mercy of the executive. Again, can we agree on electoral reform? But we couldn't get 5 clear, there was no willingness to agree and say this is the platform. You can't just go around saying we are an alternative if you don't make it clear where exactly your stress is together. That is one of the reasons why I think none of them did very well.
Yeah.
But I also think that one of the reasons why the 2 major parties did well is that they both had alternative candidates. These were fresh faces. And I think they both gave the message. Mr. Premadasa could have done it more clearly, that he wanted to get rid of all the baggage. Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa didn't say it, but I think some of the things he's done after he was elected suggest that he wants a new approach. Whether he'll be able to, I think, depends on him feeling I'm a national leader. That is why I also think it's important for Sajid to approach him. One of the problems is after President Rajapaksa won a magnificent victory against the LTT, for which the whole country must be grateful, the UNP started working with the West to undermine him. They produced Sarath Fonseca, whom everyone knows the West had until 2009 been calling the most racist general. And he was. He was the one who used to run around when President Rajapaksa was saying, I'm trying to defeat the LTT. Sarath Fonseca was the man who said, no, this country belongs to the Buddhists. Then Ranil went and adopted him and put him into parliament, and no one in the UNP objected this time. Disgraceful. So, if the opposition wants to undermine the president, then the president has to go on the defensive. That's why I was deeply upset to find Harsha De Silva starting again this white man talk. You know, that poor man shoots his mouth off and he doesn't really think before he speaks. You all have had experience of this. He's a nice boy, but he's not a patch on Iran. So he got to control himself. They've got to give the impression to Gotabaya Rajapaksa that they want to support the positive things and the reforms. They should not be driving him into the arms of the extremists. And that's what Harsha's behavior is doing now. So please tell Sajid to control these guys and say we will support the good things, but we will oppose the bad. Because you have to remember, I remember telling Mahinda Rajapaksa in 2010, you know, a few reforms would get these people off your backs, and he said, whatever I do, they'll hate me. And that was partly Ranil, who was, you know, to use the singular word, Haranava, under. That's the only way Ranil can perform now. So that put Mahinda on the defensive. And I hope that you guys don't do the same to Gotabaya, because he started well, and attacking him on irrelevant issues is not going to take the country forward. That is why I would with Sajid. You know, he has a long-term future, but that future will only come if he works towards the national interest, not his own interest.
Ishan?
Yeah, I want to touch on something a little bit more controversial, Nadim, if I may. And I want to have Professor Siri Hettige's input on this. You know, these days the talk of the town seems to be an issue relating to a particular abduction. And in the backdrop of this happening, there seems to be a lot of information going around. There seems to be no clear-cut idea as to what's happening yet. But you're still seeing that in civil society, the discourse is one that is uncertain. We have one side, one set of people essentially, let's be honest, pinning it on the government. We have one set of people pinning it on, let's say, a third party. And both sets of people, or both people following both sets of ideas, they tend not to be very open to actually believing the other people. See, you are in the police commission. Why is it that, you know, the people don't seem to have faith in the official communiques, that the people don't seem to really buy into what they are saying? Is it because the people have lost faith in these independent commissions and the police commission, or is it just politicking?
Well, I mean, this has polarized opinion, and that is what it is. And I don't think that I can add anything, you know, to that particular, you know, controversy, because the point is, you know, this has polarized opinion, and it's really going on. And what can I say? I mean, I have nothing, you know, to add to that, you know. And I think it is really up to the parties involved in this conflict to basically figure out how they could, you know, really resolve this. I don't think that an, you know, person who is outside that nexus can really say anything on that.
But
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, of course.
I think, you know, Professor Hettige, I think one needs to take a position because this is becoming a controversial issue, and I think one shouldn't announce on what one doesn't know.
No, but to take a position, you should be convinced that, you know, the side that you are taking, you know, I mean, you know, the point is that you should be convinced that you can take, you know, a side on an issue like this, you know, with confidence. Now, I mean, the point is,
but
you know,
Professor Hettige, I'm not talking about taking sides.
You know,
taking a no, there's a difference between taking a side, which I don't want to do, and taking a clear position. The facts as we have them are that there was a report of an abduction. When the police wanted to investigate, the Swiss embassy denied access to the person. There are people who say, I think rightly, that that person should not be questioned by the police without the presence of a lawyer. I think that's fair enough. But to deny even that is to actually say, we are saying there was a problem and we're not letting you question us further. You can't go to court on those issues. You know, you cannot make a complaint and say, I'm not saying anything further, I want to go abroad and stay in Switzerland safely. Because so can I finish?
No,
so
because we're talking about institutions, right?
Sorry?
We're talking about the importance of institutions. The police, there is a witness protection authority in this country that was established this thing. Why is it not that authority that is reaching out to these people, or why have we not heard anything?
When the investigation happens, it takes the normal course of events. Normally, you don't have someone making a complaint and then saying, I can't testify. But you can insist on the procedure, say, I will testify in terms of the Witness Protection Act. The embassy which made the original complaint can say very clearly, these are the ways in which further investigation can take place. Now, the government has come out with the statement that as far as they can see, the incident didn't really happen the way it was described. I'm not saying one accepts that without question. It's open to the Swiss embassy to say, we can show you that in fact your position is mistaken for the following reasons. But you can't say, no, we can't allow this lady to be asked any questions. We must send her abroad to Switzerland, not through normal immigration procedure. You see, you also have to remember, Chandra Prema had a good article on this in the Island yesterday, about what happened 5 years ago when the then political affairs officer tried to suborn the military spokesman, and Patricia Butanis went rushing to Gotabaya Rajapaksa and said, no, it was all a misunderstanding. GLP should have called her in and got the guy expelled, not Patricia. Patricia, actually, some friends of hers told me, she found this political affairs officer an embarrassment. But it was that sort of thing that was happening. So what I'm saying is on this Swiss thing, Deshan, you brought it up. I think you were right because everyone is talking about it. And I think things can be polarized. But all I'm saying is everyone should say together, let there be a clear investigation in terms of all the procedures that will ensure protection. That is the position I'm taking. I'm not taking a side. But I don't think we should prejudge the issue and like Arshada's tweet about white vans. That is uncalled for.
Let me put this question. Do you feel though that the Victim and Witness Protection Authority has the capacity to deal with this, given that it is I think its funding mechanism is the funding mechanism for the authority, which is established under the Sri Lanka Police, is not very robust?
As a general, let's say, lacuna.
Can we have faith in the institution, is what I'm asking.
The institution itself, you can have faith if, in this case, the added protection is provided by the lawyer of the Swiss embassy being there at the same time. It's not a question of saying, okay, you go to the Sri Lankan police and give your case and they will protect you. The embassy can say very clearly, our Swiss embassy lawyer must be with you all the time.
Dr. Mendis, I'll pose the same question to you, just in a general sense, because we were talking about the importance of these institutions. And, even with this incident involving the the employee of the Swiss embassy, I think it does raise the question, can we have faith in our institutions, not just our democratic institutions, but also in the institutions that are under the executive branch of government, like the Sri Lanka Police and the Victim and Witness Protection Authority? Can we have faith in these institutions?
Who in the right mind will say that we have faith in Sri Lankan institutions? We need to do some soul searching. We need to be honest. Everyone needs to be honest on this matter. We cannot be satisfied with the level of conduct of these institutions. They have proved beyond reasonable doubt.
Why can we not?
Beyond reasonable doubt that they have always violated the public trust. Now, in this matter, relating to the Swiss, controversy, well, we are not prepared to take any side. We are not taking the side of anyone. But very clearly, these things arise within an environment where the people know that so many disappearances, many killings have taken place in the past during the same regime, and up to now, they have not done anything. It's true that Wickremesinghe regime had been extremely guilty in not ensuring and enabling the due process of administration of the law to take place. These things, that's why the people...
Why? Just ask yourself why.
They have to.
Ask yourself why, Mahim,
for that.
Why?
The people are furious.
Why? There is always a reason when they were so anxious to punish people and were slavering at the mouth to take revenge. Why did they hold back? Don't you think it was because they found, as indeed the British told me way back in 2009, the evidence led to certain places that embarrassed them. So therefore they were trying to get evidence built up only to get A rather than B.
Just to interrupt, Dr. Mendes,
we always have,
what he says
I mean,
proves the
evidence, whenever we're dealing with these kinds of cases, I've found in my experience as well, is that, you know, it's always anecdotal or hearsay. It's difficult to gather evidence, and the longer it takes, the more difficult it becomes to prove.
Nadim, if I
So how do we really address that issue?
Nadim,
and
if I
have faith.
if I may add, Nadim, also Dr. Mendes, I want to bring this to your attention also. Within the last 5 years, we've had a number of issues that have also been tortures and killings reported. Two businessmen, Manjula Asanka and Rasin Chintaka from Busagol. There has been one gentleman who was tortured at the police Naivala Puhamilage Gamini Edward in Kelepitimulla Hunumulla. This is just two of a number of cases that I mentioned. So this, don't you think this is a more structural issue? This has continued over the years. It's not just one government, is it?
True. We are not saying we are not saying that this regime is better than. Of course, due to the past 5 years, there weren't, at least there weren't. We have to give credit.
No, these were during the last.
There were no politically motivated abductions and killings, where the government taking the law into its hands and ordering certain actions that led to the killing. Obviously, 27 prisoners were shot dead. Now, okay, that is quite different.
Yeah.
Now, all what we want, this government or the previous government, I'm finding fault with Wickremesinghe regime and his leadership for not enabling. Obviously, a government cannot be interfering with the administration of the law. We are not asking Wickremesinghe to do that.
Simple question.
We did not expect him to do that.
Simple question. Did any of you write formally to protest about the incidents that were pointed out? I wrote after Ratapus Sellava to the Secretary of Defense. He called up and shouted at me. But I wrote. I don't see any member of the cabinet having addressed the government like that.
We have a collective responsibility to put things right. There is a new government. Let the new government prove beyond reasonable doubt that this government is more effective.
All teams සතියේ සෑම දිනකම දහවල් 1ට
Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're entering the final round, and I'd like to start with Dr. Rajiv Vijayasinghe. He said that good governance in a democracy is impossible without fostering in our communities and the electorate the appetite for leaders with respectful conduct. Given everything that we've been talking about tonight, when you look at how we really react to issues, crisis issues. We were talking about restoring faith, or at least having faith in our institutions to do the jobs that they are entrusted to do. How, I realize that there's a limited time frame within which to answer this question, but how would you go about fixing this, restoring faith in these institutions?
It's very simple. When did MPs start becoming a joke, start becoming not respected at all, not having ties with the electorate? It's because of the current electoral system. Now, one of the biggest pledges, which you said there was consensus on, was to replace it. Ranil sabotaged that. There was a clear commitment. I can only hope that Sajid will go to the president and say, look, why don't we put this through? We're all committed to it. You want when you have MPs, the party also can select people. Now the party has to give nomination to any Tom, Dick and Harry, any thug, anyone with lots of money, and they win the election. Once you have a constituency system, you will then have respectable MPs by and large. Secondly, don't allow the nominations from the list, it should be 50% list, at the whim and fancy of the party secretary. You saw what Akila Viraj was up to now, and on the other side, it was actually Sushil Premchand who put in the defeated candidates. Make it the best losers, so that when you take people for the list from any party, they are the people who got the highest percentage but didn't get elected. So they also are elected by the people. That system will solve half our problems, because don't forget, one of the reasons for the massive corruption we have amongst all elected representatives is they have to spend so much to get elected, they want to recoup that money. You know, I take pride in the fact that I didn't sell my car permit. The minister came and said they thought I was an idiot who didn't know how to make money. But I can't take pride in that because I didn't have to spend for the election. All my colleagues had to spend millions or billions. If you get rid of the present electoral system, you will have at least 50% better people in parliament. That's my first and last very strong message, and I hope Sajid will take that up.
There's been a fair bit of, there was at least mid-2015, there was a fair bit of movement on that, on a 20th Amendment to amend the electoral system, and there was talk of introducing a combination of first past the post and proportional, a mixed member proportional system. Why was that?
Because Ranil sabotaged it. You see, we used to come to the meetings and just come up with excuse after excuse. I mean, at one point I said, look, the best, fairest way is 2 votes each. One for the constituency, one for the party. You're the only person who's saying that. So then I asked the others, every single party agreed with me that you needed 2 votes, except the UNP.
A dual ballot paper.
So basically, Ranil was determined to sabotage it because he was still dreaming of winning, he knew that on the first past the post, the other party would probably do better. So he was trying to keep the existing system. It also gives the party leadership much more control of the MPs.
Quick question, Dr. Vijay Singh. Given the current popularity of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, can we realistically expect, because he would also be expecting to win a majority of seats in Parliament under the current system, can we realistically expect his administration to push those?
Well, the one thing that Gotabaya Rajapaksa has already shown very clearly is that he wants to move towards professionalism. What will stand in his way? The only thing that will stand in his way is unprofessional parliamentarians who want all the power for themselves. So I think he would welcome support to professionalize the system. And I think, for instance, of all the young people, I was so pleased he appointed Ramesh Patirana minister. That boy is a professional. Shayan Senasinghe, Kanaka Herath. These are educated, intelligent people. Now, I think Gotabaya would prefer to work with people like that for the future. And for that, he needs a better electoral system. So I hope Sajid will also get the UNP to back a mixed system like in 2015, but 50-50%. Best loser, not a list that the party secretary nominates. Imagine Akhila Viraj being allowed to run riot with a party list. Think of the people who will come, Dinesh Dodaganu and Sarath Fonseka. So that I have to stop. And if you can do that, I think Gota would have a much more professional future for the country.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv Vijay Singh. Next, Dr. Mahim Mendis. Dr. Mendis, do you feel that we can realistically expect reforms of the kind that Dr. Vijay Singh was talking about in terms of electoral reforms, the education reforms that Professor Siri Hettige was referring to, the reforms on accountability of the individual MPs and the President and the cabinet members to the people who voted for them? On these issues, which were the same issues that were being talked about before the Yahapalne government came in, and now 5 years later we are asking, will this administration be able to do it? Do you think that there will be a push towards greater democratic governance, or do you feel that the democratic space may be shrinking?
I have every reason to believe that Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa believes in a sustainable victory. And today I read in the papers, in one of the first statements that Mr. Sajid Premadasa had made, he very clearly stated that in spite of some of these blunders, controversies that have been talked about, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa should be given sufficient time to prove. That is a very reasonable expectation from a visionary leader like Sajid Premadasa. Now, we have every reason to believe people who opposed and supported Mr. Rajapaksa believes, and I believe Mr. Rajapaksa firmly believes, that there should be a change in this country and there has to be certain decisive steps taken by him in order to face the parliamentary elections and also to make a difference, a decisive difference in the culture of governance. So we wish him the very best, just like Mrs. Sajid Premadasa. Now, of course, on the other side, we need to have very urgently a visionary opposition leader and a new leadership for the UNP very clearly established without wasting any further time. That is very clear. This has to be done through consensual political culture established, a new way of looking at things by a refined government and a refined opposition. What has happened during the past 26 years with Mr. Wickremesinghe's leadership, well, we do not accept. That is why we wanted a change in the leadership and the candidature. We can only hope that Mr. Rajapaksa will succeed. We want him to succeed. Who will want him to fail in this matter? We want him to succeed, though we have voted against him. But let there be hope, faithfulness in people to allow these people to do a job of work in a respectable and an honorable manner. We wish him well, but let him prove his walk, not just a talk. Let him prove his talk by doing the walk in an honorable manner.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mendis. And finally, Professor Siri Hettige. Professor, in the sort of interregnum that we're going to have before the parliamentary elections, which, unless, of course, the two-thirds of members decide prior to March that Parliament should be dissolved, will be, let's say, Parliament is dissolved around March, maybe slightly later. In that interregnum period, with the current cabinet of 15 that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has and his state ministers and other appointments, what should he really be looking to do? What should be the focus areas for the president?
Well, I think we have to look at it from the point of view of the people who really elect governments, rather than from the point of view of the leaders. Because, you know, when you look at people, they would certainly want to have a better future, you know, not only for themselves, but also for the country. Now, the question is whether we want to have a shared future, whether we want to have a future just for, you know, sectarian groups. For instance, you know, when you have an electoral process, you have people participating in the electoral process, not on the basis of a shared vision or a shared, you know, let's say, goal of having a better future. But the point is that we have to, you know, really transcend the divisions that we have in this country today, not only in terms of, you know, political party lines, but also in terms of various other divisions. Like, for instance, you know, serious rural-urban disparities that we have in this country, class differences, you know, economic inequalities, you know, in terms of having access to resources, you know, and so on and so forth. So the point is that people would certainly want to have a better future, but a shared future, because, you know, it is only when you have a shared future that you will be able to really transcend these divisions, and create a society where people will be working together to create that better, you know, shared future. I think we should probably look at it from that angle. I think the leaders can certainly, you know, contribute to that. And if the leaders, you know, identify with the shared vision of the people of having a better future, I think we will have the synergy that is required for us to move forward. Because I think, you know, we have been struggling in this country for the last several decades. And I don't think that people can continue to struggle. You know, some of us are privileged, and I don't think that we are struggling on a day-to-day basis. But we have a huge, you know, proportion of the population in this country struggling to have basic things. So I think we need to really look at it from the point of view of the people, and it is only fair that the leaders identify with the people in the country and, you know, share their vision for a better future. I think that is where we are at the moment, and I hope that people will certainly come together. I'm talking here about the leaders, and as much as you talked about consensus across party lines, we also need, you know, consensus built, you know, across, you know, various divisions that we have. Society people have been talking about the division between the north and the south, and I think these are things that we have really struggled with, and I don't think that we can struggle with these things any further, because the challenges that we have faced are so enormous that we certainly have to find common ground in order to move forward and create a better future for the people in this country.
Thank you very much, Professor Hettige. Rightly say it's difficult to build consensus when you're unable to respect the views of your opponent. That being said, thank you very much, Professor Hettige. Thank you, Dr. Mari Mendis, and thank you also to Dr. Rajiv.